This happened a couple of years ago when I was really into hiking. I used to go out almost every weekend, just me and the trails, getting lost in nature. It was my way of unwinding, leaving all the stress behind and just walking, breathing in the fresh air. I had this list of trails I wanted to check off, and one of them was this lesser-known path about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. Not too many people knew about it, which made it even more appealing to me. I was all about finding those hidden gems. So, it was a Saturday morning, and I packed up my gear and drove out to this trailhead. I got there pretty early, around 7 a.m., because I wanted to get a head start and make the most of the day. When I pulled up, I noticed there were no other cars around. It was just me in the forest. At first I was excited. Having the whole place to myself sounded perfect. But looking back, maybe that should have been my first warning. The trail started out pretty standard. It was narrow and a bit overgrown, not like the more popular trails with clear paths and signs everywhere. But that's what I liked about it. It felt like a real adventure, like I was exploring something untouched. The forest was thick with trees, and after a while, the sounds of the highway faded away until all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and my own footsteps. About an hour in, I came across this old, rusted sign. It was barely readable, but I could make out something about the trail being closed. It looked ancient, like it had been there for decades. I thought maybe it was just outdated and the trail was fine now, so I kept going. Besides, I had come all this way. I wasn't about to turn back just because of some old sign. The deeper I went, the stranger the trail got. There were parts where it seemed like the forest was reclaiming it, trees and bushes growing right across the path. It was almost like nature was trying to hide this place. But I pushed on, figuring I'd eventually come out to a clearing or something. Then, after about another hour, I noticed something that really put me on edge. The forest was silent. I mean, completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. It was like I had stepped into a vacuum or something. I stopped for a moment, looking around, trying to figure out what was off. But everything just seemed still. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw something up ahead that made me stop in my tracks. It was this old, run-down cabin, right in the middle of the woods. It looked abandoned, the kind of place you see in horror movies. The windows were broken, and the wood was all rotted and covered in moss. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the part where any sane person would turn around and head back. But I was curious. Maybe too curious for my own good. I wanted to check it out, see what was inside. So, I walked up to the cabin, my heart pounding a little harder with each step. When I got to the front door, I saw it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me, but it was empty. Just an old, dusty room with a couple of broken chairs and a table. It smelled like mold and decay. I walked in, trying to be as quiet as possible. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could feel my adrenaline kicking in. I looked around the room, not really sure what I was looking for. There wasn't much to see, just some old furniture and a fireplace. But then I noticed something on the floor, near the far corner of the room. It was a set of footprints, clear as day in the dust. They weren't mine, and they looked fresh, like someone had been here recently. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. I backed up towards the wall, my eyes scanning the room. It was empty, but the footprints were there, leading from the door to the corner where they just stopped. I decided it was time to leave. I started to back out of the cabin, not taking my eyes off the corner where the footprints ended. But as I reached the door, I heard something outside. It was this low, rumbling sound, like an engine idling. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around, but I didn't see anything. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I figured it was probably a car on some back road, but it didn't make sense. There were no roads out here, not that I knew of. I decided to head back to the trail, picking up the pace. My heart was racing, and I could feel that creeping sense of dread starting to take over. As I got back to the trail, I realized something was wrong. The trail markers I had been following were gone. I mean, they were just gone. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where I had come from. but it was like the forest had shifted. Nothing looked familiar. I was completely turned around. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. I tried to use the GPS, but it wasn't picking up my location. Great, I thought. This is how people end up in those survival stories. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I just needed to retrace my steps and get back to the main trail. I started walking, trying to remember the way I came, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, underbrush. It was like the forest was playing tricks on me. Then, I heard the engine sound again, closer this time. It was this deep, rumbling noise, but I still couldn't see where it was coming from. I stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. It was hard to tell, but it seemed to be coming from my right. I hesitated, not sure if I should go towards it or away from it. I mean, if it was a car, maybe it was someone who could help me get out of here. I decided to go towards the sound, hoping I'd find a road or something. I pushed through the underbrush, trying to keep the noise in my ears, but it was like it was moving, always staying just out of sight. I kept walking, getting more frustrated and scared with every step. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing, but this one wasn't empty. In the middle of the clearing, there was an old rusted car, just sitting there. It looked like it had been there for years, covered in vines and leaves. The engine wasn't running, but the hood was up, and there were tools scattered around on the ground. I approached the car cautiously, looking around for any sign of who might have been working on it, but there was no one. It was like they had just disappeared. I walked around to the front of the car, and that's when I saw it. On the driver's seat, there was a map, just like the one I had, with the same trail marked on it. But this map had something written on it, scrawled in red ink. It said, "Don't go back." My blood ran cold. What the hell was going on? I backed away from the car, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here, and fast. I turned and started running, not caring which direction I was going anymore. I just needed to put as much distance between me and that car as possible. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like lead. I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath. I looked around, and for the first time, I saw something familiar. A trail marker, off in the distance. I got up and stumbled towards it, hoping it was the way out. As I got closer, I realized it was the same marker I had seen before, the one near the cabin. I was going in circles. I was trapped. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I needed to stay calm, needed to think. I took a deep breath and looked around, trying to figure out my next move. That's when I heard the engine again, louder this time, like it was right on top of me. I looked around, but there was still no sign of where it was coming from. It was like the forest itself was alive, taunting me, playing with me. I started walking again, trying to stay focused, trying to find my way out. But the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees getting denser and the path more obscured. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I stumbled out onto a road. It wasn't the trailhead, but it was something. I followed it, praying it would lead me back to civilization. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a car coming towards me. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older guy, rolled down his window. I must have looked like a mess because he asked if I was okay. I told him I was lost and needed a ride back to town. He agreed, and I got in, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see something or someone watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. The driver asked what I was doing out there, and I told him I was hiking. He gave me a strange look and said that trail had been closed for years, ever since someone went missing out there and was never found. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring out the window, trying to process what had happened. I still don't know what I saw or heard out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going hiking alone again. Some places are better left unexplored, and sometimes curiosity can lead you down a path you're not meant to take. I've always loved hiking. It's my way to disconnect, to get away from the constant noise of city life. So when a friend suggested we go hiking at this relatively unknown trail a couple of hours from the city, I was all in. The plan was to get an early start, spend the day exploring, and head back before dusk. We set out on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, the car loaded with snacks, water, and all the gear we'd need. The drive was pretty uneventful, and as we got closer to the trailhead, the roads got narrower and more isolated. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere, which I guess was the point. No cell service, no people, just nature. We finally arrived at this small, almost hidden parking area near the trailhead. There were no other cars around, which was a little surprising, but not entirely unexpected, given how remote this place was. We grabbed our stuff, double-checked the map, and set off. The trail started off easy enough, winding through dense forest. It was quiet, almost too quiet, with just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaves and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. For the first couple of hours, everything was perfect. We were chatting, taking photos, and just enjoying being out there. Then about 3 miles in, we came across this old, rickety bridge over a narrow creek. It wasn't marked on our map, which was odd because the trail was supposed to be straightforward. We debated whether or not to cross it, but curiosity got the better of us. It was a bit of a gamble, but the bridge looked sturdy enough. Plus, we figured it might lead to something interesting. We crossed the bridge one at a time, carefully testing each step. It creaked and swayed a bit, but we made it across without incident. The trail on the other side was narrower and less worn, like it hadn't been used in a while. But we decided to keep going, figuring we'd turn back if it got too sketchy. As we ventured deeper, the trees grew thicker, and the canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight. It got darker, colder even, like we were walking into a different world. The air felt heavier, and the sounds of the forest around us seemed to fade away. It was unsettling, but we pressed on, driven by that weird mix of excitement and unease. After another half hour or so, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of it was this old, abandoned campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, a couple of rusted, broken-down camping chairs, and a torn tent flapping in the wind. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten by time. We looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. We weren't alone out here, at least not once. Someone had camped here, maybe even lived here for a while. But why would they leave all this stuff behind? It didn't make sense. We poked around a bit, not really sure what we were looking for. Everything was covered in a layer of dirt and moss, like the forest had been slowly reclaiming it. Then we found the notebook. It was half buried under some leaves, the cover weathered and torn. I picked it up and carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed and damp, but the writing was still legible. It was a journal, or at least what was left of one. The entries were short, scattered, and they didn't make much sense. Most of it was just ramblings, like someone had been writing down their thoughts in a hurry. One entry caught my eye. It talked about being followed, about feeling watched every time they went into the woods. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. The last entry was the most disturbing. It simply said, "I can hear them at night. They're getting closer." And then it ended. No more entries, no explanation, just silence. I showed it to my friend, and we both felt this chill run down our spines. We had no idea who wrote it or what had happened to them, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something we shouldn't be. We decided it was time to head back, to get out of there before the sun started to set. We turned around and started retracing our steps, moving a little faster this time. The forest around us felt different now, more oppressive. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made us jump. We didn't talk much, just focused on getting back to that bridge. After what felt like forever, we reached the spot where the bridge should have been, but it wasn't there. We stood there in disbelief, staring at the creek. There was no bridge, no sign that there had ever been one. The creek was flowing quietly, but it was too wide and deep to cross without it. Panic started to set in. We were sure this was the right spot, but the bridge was gone. We looked around, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. We were stuck on this side of the creek with no way to get across. We decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead us to a shallower spot where we could cross. As we walked, the light started to fade. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. After a while, we came to this small waterfall, where the creek split into two. There was a narrow path leading up the side of the hill, so we followed it, thinking it might lead us back to the main trail. It was steep and slippery, and more than once, I thought we were going to lose our footing. We finally made it to the top, and that's when we saw it, a cabin. It was old, with a sagging roof and boarded up windows, sitting in a small clearing. It looked abandoned, but there was something off about it. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, the kind of place that makes every instinct in your body scream to turn around and run. But we were lost and running out of daylight, so we decided to check it out, thinking maybe it would give us some clue about where we were. We approached cautiously, my friend in the lead. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on one hinge, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. We stepped inside and the smell hit us first. Damp, mold, and something else. Something metallic. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the setting sun through the gaps in the walls. There was a small table in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, with a single chair tipped over next to it. On the floor, there were old newspapers scattered around, their headlines faded and unreadable. In the corner, there was a pile of old, tattered clothes and what looked like a small bundle wrapped in a dirty blanket. My friend approached it, lifting the edge of the blanket. It was just an old camping backpack, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Then we heard it, a creaking sound coming from the other side of the cabin, like floorboards groaning under someone's weight. We both froze, eyes wide, staring at each other. The sound came again, closer this time. We turned to look, but the cabin was empty. There was no one there. We didn't wait to find out what was making that noise. We bolted out of the cabin and ran, not caring about the trail or where we were going, just needing to get away from that place. We crashed through the underbrush, our hearts pounding in our chests, not looking back. After what felt like hours, we stumbled back onto the main trail, the sun now completely gone, and the forest plunged into darkness. We fumbled with our flashlights, trying to get our bearings. We were exhausted, our nerves frayed, but we kept moving, driven by the need to get out of those woods. We finally made it back to the parking area, out of breath and shaken. We threw our gear into the car and peeled out of there without a second thought. We didn't talk much on the drive back, both of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never did figure out what that was all about, whether it was some kind of prank, an overactive imagination, or something else entirely. But I haven't been able to shake that feeling, that sense of being watched, of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be. It's stuck with me, like a shadow that follows you in the corner of your eye, always just out of sight. That hike changed something in me. I still love being out in nature, but there's a part of me that can't help but feel uneasy, like I'm intruding on something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And every now and then, when I'm out on a trail and I hear a rustling in the bushes or a creaking in the trees, I can't help but wonder if it's just the wind or if it's something else, something that was there all along, watching and waiting. I used to go hiking pretty often, especially on weekends. It was my way of getting away from the craziness of the city, you know? Just being out there in nature, away from all the noise and stress. It always felt like a breath of fresh air. I never really thought much about it being dangerous. I mean, sure, I knew to stay on the trail, bring enough water, the usual stuff. But this one hike, it made me see things differently. So this happened a couple of years ago. It was late summer, and I was feeling pretty burnt out from work. I decided to take a solo hike on this trail I'd heard about, but never actually tried. It was a bit more remote than the ones I usually went on, but that was kind of the appeal. I wanted somewhere quiet, where I could just clear my head. I got up early, packed my backpack with all the essentials, water, snacks, a first aid kit, you know the drill. I even brought a little portable charger for my phone, just in case. The drive there was about 2 hours, mostly through winding mountain roads. It was pretty scenic, but also kind of isolated. I didn't see many other cars on the way, which was a little unsettling, but I shrugged it off. I figured it was just because it was a less popular trail. When I got to the trailhead, there were only 2 other cars in the parking area. It was quiet, almost eerily so. I sat in my car for a minute, debating if I should even do this, but then I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was here to relax and enjoy the hike, so that's what I was going to do. I started the hike around 9 a.m. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forest with occasional glimpses of the valley below. The trees were tall and thick, creating this kind of canopy over the path. It was exactly what I was looking for. Peaceful, secluded, a perfect escape. I walked for about an hour, taking my time, stopping now and then to take pictures and just soak in the atmosphere. Around noon, I reached this small clearing where I decided to take a break. I sat down on a rock, pulled out a granola bar, and just enjoyed the quiet. The sun was filtering through the trees, and there was this slight breeze. It was perfect. After a while, I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising out here, but I wasn't worried. I was planning on heading back soon anyway. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound, like someone walking through the underbrush. I froze, my eyes scanning the trees around me. It was probably just an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or a squirrel. But the sound was too heavy for that, too deliberate. It was like footsteps, but slower, like someone trying to move quietly. I stood up, my heart starting to race a bit. I called out, hoping it was just another hiker. No response. The rustling stopped, and it was dead silent again. I waited for a moment, listening, but I didn't hear anything else. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind, or some animal I couldn't see. I decided it was probably time to head back. I packed up my stuff and started walking, trying to keep a steady pace. But now I was on edge. Every little noise made me jump. The trail felt different on the way back, like it was longer and more twisted than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but it was always just trees and shadows. After about half an hour, I noticed something strange. I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while. There had been these little wooden signs every so often to let you know you were on the right path, but now there were none. I started to worry that maybe I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen any forks in the trail. I stopped to check my phone, hoping to get a GPS fix, but still no signal. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of being lost out here, alone, was starting to get to me. I decided to keep moving, hoping I'd see a marker soon. The rustling sound came back, louder this time, like it was closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to be all around me. I called out again, louder this time, but the only response was the rustling getting fainter, like it was moving away. I felt this chill run down my spine. I knew something was out there, but I couldn't see it. I stood there for what felt like forever, just listening, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. Everything went silent again, and that was almost worse. I started walking again, faster this time. I wasn't running yet, but I was close. I just wanted to get out of there. Back to the car, back to somewhere with people. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and the further I went, the less familiar it looked. I was starting to think I was really lost. Then I saw it. Up ahead, just off the trail, there was this old, broken-down cabin. It wasn't on the map or anything. I had no idea it was there. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and vines growing up the sides. But what really got to me was the door. It was wide open, like someone had just walked in. I felt this wave of fear wash over me. There was no reason for me to go near that cabin, but I couldn't help but stare at it. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but something about it just drew me in. I don't know why I did it, but I started walking toward the cabin. Every part of me was screaming to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. I just had to see what was inside. As I got closer, I noticed that the door wasn't just open. It was hanging off its hinges, like it had been forced open. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The interior was dark and musty, with a dirt floor and cobwebs in the corners. There was old furniture scattered around, covered in dust and mold. It looked like no one had been there for years, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently. Then, I saw it. On the floor, in the middle of the room, there was a pile of old clothes. They looked like they had been there for a long time, but there was something about them that felt off, like they hadn't been just left there, but placed, almost like a warning. I felt this overwhelming urge to get out of there, to just run and not look back. I turned around and practically sprinted out of the cabin, back to the trail. I didn't care if I was lost. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. I kept running until I was out of breath, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I stopped for a second, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I heard it again, the rustling. But this time it was different. It was louder, more frantic, like something was running through the woods. I didn't wait to see what it was. I took off again, running as fast as I could, not caring about the trail or the markers. I just ran, my mind racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail, the one I had started on. I saw the parking area up ahead, and I've never been so relieved in my life. I practically flew to my car, jumping in and locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a minute, trying to calm down, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I looked back toward the trail, expecting to see something come out of the woods, but there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest, like it had been the whole time. I started the car and drove out of there, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise. I felt safe again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there in the woods. I don't know what it was. Maybe just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe something else. But I haven't been back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. It's like once you feel that kind of fear, that feeling of being hunted, it sticks with you. It changes the way you see things, even the things you used to love.